A racist cop shattered her skull with a baton, no warning, no crime, no mercy. But as she lay bleeding on the street, he didn't know her sister wore a federal judge's robe. By morning, the same badge that silenced her would face the one courtroom no lie could escape. What happens next will leave you breathless. Before we continue this powerful story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another powerful story you won't want to miss. The city was quiet in that uneasy way, where silence didn't mean peace, but the absence of witnesses. Leona Hayes stepped off the bus at Baxter and 3rd, the soles of her sneakers striking the damp concrete, sending faint echoes down the deserted street. The air smelled of rain and metal, a mix that clung to your clothes and reminded you where you were. She adjusted the canvas bag on her shoulder, shifting the weight of thick law textbooks against her back, and began walking home. Why are you here? Blood-streaked shot, well lit but deserted at this hour. Her thoughts drifted back to her constitutional law class earlier that evening. Professor Dorsey's voice still rang in her mind, sharp and cautionary. Know your rights, but know how to survive long enough to use them. The room had chuckled then, not because it was funny, but because every student knew it was true. Leona had learned those lessons long before law school, in grocery store aisles, on public transit, during every late-night walk home, where she blended caution with confidence like armor. Her fingers brushed the pepper spray in her coat pocket, a reflex she'd barely noticed anymore. She glanced around, seeing no one, yet feeling everything. Even in stillness, danger could creep in unnoticed. As she turned onto the next block, a chill slipped beneath her coat, and with it came the low, unmistakable hum of a car engine crawling behind her. She didn't turn right away. You never turned first. Instead, she let the streetlight shadows stretch across her path while her pulse began to tick faster beneath her ribs. She glanced to the side and saw an unmarked patrol cruiser moving slow, headlights off, tires whispering against the curb. Her shoulders stiffened, her breath slowed, but she kept walking, pace steady, face calm. You never gave them your... If you gave them that, they'd take everything else. The cruiser inched closer, the silence between them growing heavier with every step. Leona's mind mapped out her surroundings. No open stores, no pedestrian, just brick walls and iron gates, and windows closed against the night. Her building was just beyond the corner, almost there, almost home. But survival wasn't about almost. The cruiser gave a sharp chirp of its siren, quick clips, deliberate. Leona stopped, slowly, calmly. She turned to face them, her hands visible at her sides. The way her mother taught her when she was 12 years old, calm, clear, no sudden movements. The driver's side door opened, and out stepped Officer Dale Millet. Mid-40s, square build, white male, with a face that had smiled through 100 unchecked stops. His dark utility vest hugged a body built on the expectation of obedience. His nameplate caught the yellow glow of the street lamp. Millet, the other officer, younger, sat behind the wheel, hand resting near the radio, face tense but quiet. Millet approached, boots clicking on the wet sidewalk. His voice was casual but sharp, like a dull knife still capable of cutting deep. "Evening, where you headed tonight?" Leona kept her voice steady. "I'm heading home, just down the block." She nodded toward the duplex she rented, never breaking eye contact. No guilt, no fear, just quiet certainty. But Mi's smirk deepened. He was already writing his own story in his mind, and in his story she was guilty. "You live around here?" he asked, voice laced with suspicion. "Yes, sir," she said evenly. "I'm a student. I just finished class." She paused for half a breath. "Law school. Amelo, an intern with the DOJ." For a moment, she thought that might shift the ground beneath them, but it didn't. If anything, his grin curled darker, more amused. "Ooh, a law student." He said it like an insult, not an accomplishment. "Guess you think you know your rights, then." She met his gaze without flinching. I know them well enough. The moment stretched, taut and uneasy. Behind them, the city stayed silent, offering no witness to what was unfolding. The younger officer, Koichi thought his name was, shifted slightly in his seat, but made no move to intervene. His silence felt as loud as the night around them. Got any ID on you? Mie asked, already knowing the answer. He wasn't asking to check it. He was asking to watch her move. Yes, she replied, tone calm but cautious. It's in my bag. May I reach for it? The question wasn't for permission. It was for protection. Any wrong move could become justification. Mie shrugged, a lazy gesture. Go ahead. But something in the tilt of his head, the way his hand hovered too close to the baton on his belt, made her pause. She moved slowly, deliberately. One hand held the bag open, the other reached inside, fingers brushing against the worn leather of her wallet. She could feel the tension coil between them. This wasn't about checking her ID. This was about control. Mie shifted his stance, his boots scuffing the pavement, their eyes locked, hers steady. His calculating, "You seem nervous," he said, voice soft but cruel. "Why would you be nervous if you haven't done anything wrong?" "I'm not nervous," she replied, though her pulse betrayed her. "I'm just being careful." He chuckled, a low, hollow sound. "You fit the description," he added, almost offhandedly. "Black female, late 20s, athletic build, theft reported a few blocks over." She didn't react. "That's not me." The words hung between them, clear and simple. But Mie wasn't looking for clarity. He was looking for submission. The younger officer finally stepped out of the car. His presence was quieter, uncertain. He glanced at Leona, then at Mie, hesitation flickering across his face, but he said nothing. And in that moment, Leona knew this wasn't going to end with words. She took a slow breath, choosing her next words carefully. "Officer, I'd like to speak to your supervisor." The request landed like a spark in dry grass. Mie's smile vanished. Not anger, not surprise, something colder. "You don't get to make demands out here," he said, stepping closer. "Not tonight." The sidewalk suddenly felt narrower, the shadows stretched longer. Leona could feel the tightrope beneath her feet, every word a balancing act between dignity and danger. "I'm standing on a public street, walking home from class. I haven't committed a crime," she said, her voice firm but respectful. Mie's eyes narrowed. "What I say is law out here." And then, without warning, his hand dropped to the baton at his side. Slow at first, like a threat, then fast, terrifyingly fast. She saw it coming but couldn't stop it. The baton swung in a cruel arc, striking her just above the left eyebrow. The crack echoed down the empty street, sharp and sickening. Her vision exploded into white, then red. The concrete seemed to tilt beneath her feet. She staggered, her bag slipping from her shoulder, knees buckling, not from weakness, but from the sheer shock of the blow. She tasted blood. But somehow, through the ringing in her ears and the pounding in her skull, she forced herself upright. Her hand pressed against her temple, blood warm and sticky beneath her fingers. And, though her body screamed in pain, her voice stayed steady, quiet, but unbreakable. "You assaulted me," she whispered. Mie tilted his head slightly, as if inspecting his handiwork. Then he smirked, the same cruel grin from before. "You moved," he said flatly. "I acted." Officer Kawai froze beside them, his mouth opening slightly but saying nothing. His silence was deafening. The night air chilled around them, thick with power and pain. Leona stood there, bleeding but unbroken, staring into the eyes of a man who believed no one would stop him. And in that moment, she knew two things. She would survive this. And he had just made the worst mistake of his life. The moment the baton struck, everything shifted. Mie's voice sharpened instantly, transforming the quiet street into a stage for his authority. "Hands behind your back," he barked, though his tone held an edge far from concern or caution. It was a command backed by a certainty that he could do whatever he wanted, and no one would stop him. Leona's hands trembled as they were pulled behind her. The cuffs clicked tight around her wrists, biting into skin raw from pressure. She didn't resist. There was no struggle, no fight. She only stood there, steady and silent, even as her vision blurred with blood and pain. Officer Kawai stood close, watching. His face was pale, mouth set in a thin line. There was hesitation in his eyes, an unspoken battle between loyalty and truth. But when Meej turned to him, he offered no protest, no intervention. His silence became a quiet consent to the injustice unfolding. Mie leaned closer to Leona's ear. "Resisting arrest," he said low, as if rehearsing the lie that would follow. "You made it worse on yourself." Leona's breath caught, but her voice didn't falter. "I did not resist." He shrugged as if her words were meaningless. "We'll see what the report says." The irony hung heavy in the air. The man who had just struck her was now the author of her fate. The patrol cruiser waited a few feet away, its engine rumbling softly, like a beast, ready to pounce. Me motioned for Leona to get in. She moved carefully, head bowed to avoid the sharp sting pulsing from her temple. As the door shut behind her, the confined space pressed in vinyl seats, worn thin, faint smells of bleach and sweat. She sat rigid, wrists aching from the tight cuffs, blood drying along her hairline. Each bump on the road sent jolts through her body, but her mind remained clear, refusing to break. He sat up front, one hand tapping the dashboard rhythmically, the other lazily draped over the steering wheel. A soft tune hummed from the radio, oblivious to the storm in the back seat. Beside him, Cowie stared out the window, his fingers clenching the edge of his seat. His jaw clenched tightly, as if biting back a confession he wasn't ready to make. He hadn't signed up for this. Not the violence, not the lies. But here he was, complicit by silence. Leona's eyes remained fixed on the rain-meckled window, the city lights blurring into streaks of color. She thought about the professor's words, "Know how to survive." She was surviving, for now. The station came into view, its harsh fluorescent lights stabbing the darkness. As the cruiser pulled into the lot, Leona's heartbeat quickened. Not from fear, but from the weight of what was to come. This wasn't just an arrest. It was an attempt to arrest. Inside the station, the air was colder, sterile, and indifferent. The front desk sergeant barely looked up when Mie announced, "Another one." Leona was yanked from the cruiser, the cuffs tugging against her wrists. She barely noticed the sting on her temple anymore. The sting of dismissal was far worse. She was led to the booking room, where the fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a pallid glow on cracked tiles. An officer glanced at her with bored eyes. "Name?" "Leona Hayes," she replied, voice steady. "Occupation?" "Law student. DOJ intern." The man snorted. No acknowledgement, no respect. Just another name to be processed. Another statistic to file away. Mie stood over a computer, fingers tapping keys as he composed his official report. The words flowed smoothly. Suspect resisted verbal commands. Became combative. Officer deployed appropriate force. A narrative carefully crafted to justify brutality, to conceal truth. Leona watched from the corner, fists clenched in her lap. Each word in that report was a lie, each sentence a calculated erasure of her reality. The process was mechanical. Fingerprinting, photographing bruises that weren't supposed to exist, recording statements that would never see the light of day. Every step chipped away at the truth, but not at her resolve. She sat in the holding cell with cold walls closing in, the metal bench pressed into her spine, but she refused to curl up or break down. Crying was a luxury reserved for the weak, and she wasn't weak. The hours passed slow and merciless. Voices echoed faintly through the corridors, but none called her name with kindness or concern. Her fingers grazed the bloodstain on her jeans, the crimson spreading like a silent scream. She whispered to herself, "They have no idea who I am." Because they didn't. Not yet. The night pressed on outside, heavy and silent, as Leona sat alone in the cold holding cell. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting long, sterile shadows across the cracked floor and cold metal bench where she sat upright, her back rigid against the unforgiving wall. The sting from her bruised temple pulsed steadily, a sharp reminder of the violence-inflicted moments, but she refused to let the pain unravel her. Her thoughts drifted back to her mother's words, lessons drilled into her since childhood. Dignity is your shield, even when the world tries to strip it away. She clung to that shield now, wrapping it around herself tighter than any coat. The tears welled but never spilled. Crying was a luxury she could not afford. Not here, not now. Outside the bars, Officer Cowie paced nervously, his steps uneven, betraying the storm of guilt raging inside him. He paused, then looked up, catching Leona's gaze through the cold metal. For a long moment, their eyes locked, hers steady and unyielding, his flickering with uncertainty and regret. It was an unspoken apology, a silent confession of complicity, but he said nothing. The weight of his silence was heavier than any spoken word. Leona's mind played the night's events on repeat. The way Mia's baton rose without warning, the sharp crack against her skin, the rush of pain flooding her senses, how quickly the simple act of walking home had morphed into a nightmare. Despite the swelling pain and the dry blood crusted at her hairline, she refused to be broken. Strength didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered in quiet resilience, in the steady beat of a heart refusing to yield. Hours passed in slow, suffocating waves. Distant voices drifted through the wall, laughter somewhere down the hall, the murmur of officers moving about their duties. But none of it pierced her solitude. In this space, time lost meaning, stretched and thinned until the only thing real was the quiet promise she made to herself. She would not disappear, not like this. Finally, when the clock allowed, she was granted a single phone call. Her hands trembled as she picked up the receiver, the coiled cord twisting gently around her wrist like a lifeline. With deliberate calm, she dialed a number she had memorized but had not used in months, a number tethered to hope and Nye. The line rang once, twice, 3 times. Then a voice answered, familiar, steady, cautious. "Regina," she whispered, her sister's name carrying the weight of protection, of justice. "Leona," came the reply, low and measured. "Where are you?" "A station," she said simply. "False charges. I need you to listen." A pause, thick and heavy with unspoken fear and urgency. "Tell me everything, slowly." Leona recounted the encounter, Mai's false accusations, the strike, the cuffs. Regina's silence on the other end was a calm force, absorbing every detail without judgment. She heard the shuffling of papers, the click of a pen scratching across legal pads. Regina was already moving, calculating. "Officer's name?" she asked. Maria dropped her head lower. "Hold tight. Don't speak to anyone else. I'll handle the rest." Leona exhaled slowly, the line clicking dead in her hand. She felt a strange mix of exhaustion and renewed strength. The battle was just beginning, but she was no longer alone. As she folded her hands in her lap and leaned back against the cold wall, she whispered to the empty cell, "They have no idea who I am." And somewhere deep inside, she believed it. The clock on the wall ticked slowly toward 3 a.m., a time when the world seemed to pause between exhaustion and a restless dawn. Leona sat quietly in the dim holding cell, muscles aching, head throbbing beneath the makeshift gauze taped clumsily over the bruise. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the phone, a single lifeline amid the concrete walls. She had only one call, one chance to reach beyond these walls and the lies they'd begun to weave around her. The number was etched deep into her memory, a string of digits that belonged to someone who could cut through the dark and bring light to this nightmare. With a steady breath, she dialed. The phone rang, once, twice, 3 times. A voice answered, steady, calm, and measured. "Regina," she whispered, a whisper loaded with everything she felt, but couldn't say aloud. Her sister, the woman who had worn the black robe of a federal judge longer than Leona had walked these streets, a pillar of strength and unwavering justice. "Leona," came the reply, smooth and sure. No hesitation, no surprise, just concern wrapped in quiet fury. "Where are you?" "At county station. False charges. I need you to listen." A pause, thick with gravity. Regina's silence spoke volumes. There were no quick reassurances here, only the sober reality of what was happening. "Tell me everything," slowly. Leona took a breath and began. She recounted the night, the police cruiser lurking in the shadows, Officer Maillet's interrogation, the demand for her ID, the refusal to listen, and then the cruel baton swinging down, breaking the calm with a crack that echoed far beyond her temple. She told her sister about Kauai, the younger officer, the silent witness who had watched but said nothing. Each word was a thread weaving a tapestry of truth, fragile but unyielding. Regina listened, absorbing every detail with the steady focus of someone who had faced battles far darker and more complicated than this. The sound of shuffling papers reached Leona's ears, the scratch of pen on legal pads as her sister prepared to act. "What are their names?" Regina asked quietly. "Deo mia," Leona whispered. "And Cowie, he was there. He saw it." Regina's voice grew firmer. "Hold tight. Don't speak to anyone else. I'll handle the rest." Leona exhaled slowly, feeling a flicker of hope ignite in the cold night. The promise of justice was no longer distant. It was taking shape. Her sister had moved, and with her, the machinery of law and accountability. As the line went dead, Leona folded her hands in her lap and leaned back against the unforgiving wall. The cell was still cold, the hours still heavy, but inside her, a quiet fire burned, a determination to see this through, no matter what came next. The night was far from over. Regina Hayes sat in the quiet of her home office, the glow of her laptop illuminating the sharp lines of her face. The night outside was still, but inside her mind, a storm was gathering. She had heard the call, the urgent whisper from her sister trapped behind cold walls and harsher lies. The details were grim but familiar. This was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a system that had long forgotten how to serve justice, especially when the truth threatened those who wielded power with impunity. Without hesitation, Regina picked up the phone. Her first call went to the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. Her voice was calm, but authorities, as she relayed the situation, "We have a serious allegation of excessive force and false reporting," she said. "I expect immediate attention." Next, she dialed the U.S. Attorney's Office, her tone firm but measured. "This case requires expedited review. We're looking at potential civil rights violations. I want you to coordinate with Internal Affairs and prepare for a federal investigation." Finally, Regina called an old contact in Internal Affairs, someone she trusted despite the bureaucracy and backroom politics. She didn't need to explain much. The favor owed was clear in the quiet intensity of her voice. "This needs to be off the books until sunrise. Once it's public, there's no turning back." She hung up the phone and leaned back in her chair. The wheels were turning now, moving faster than anyone at the station would expect. Regina had built her career on quiet, power-using influence, precisely, strategically, without fanfare. Tonight was no different. Meanwhile, across town, federal agents prepared for the early morning. Their faces were tired, but resolute. They didn't need theatrics or public announcements. Their job was to uncover truth, hidden beneath layers of deception and silence. By dawn, 2 unmarked cars slipped into the police station parking lot. The presence of plainclothes agents shifted the atmosphere inside instantly. Officers exchanged wary glances. Whispers replaced casual chatter. The clock ticked down to a reckoning no one in that building could ignore. Back in the holding cell, Leona closed her eyes and breathed deeply. The pain in her head throbbed relentlessly, but her breathing slowed, controlled. She repeated her sister's words silently. "Hold tight. I'll handle the rest." Those words were more than a promise. They were a lifeline. The cell felt less like a cage and more like a crucible, a place where her strength was forged in quiet resolve. She was no longer alone in this fight. Somewhere beyond those walls, a force was rising on her behalf. Leona's thoughts turned to the days ahead, unpredictable, dangerous, but necessary. Justice was a path she had never chosen willingly, but now she walked it with clear eyes and a steady heart. The first light of dawn seeped through the narrow windows of the police station, casting long shadows across the cold linoleum floors. Two unmarked cars pulled into the parking lot quietly, almost unnoticed by the early shift officers arriving for their duties. But those who caught sight of the plainclothes agents stepping inside immediately sensed a shift. The agents moved through the station with measured purpose, their presence commanding respect without raising their voices. There were no flashing badges or loud announcements, only the weight of the law behind every step they took. Their arrival was a quiet storm, imminent and inescapable. Inside the holding cell, Leona sat with her eyes closed, the pain from the swelling bruise pulsing faintly beneath the gauze on her temple. But her mind was alert, listening for the sounds that would herald the turning tide. Footsteps approached, the deliberate cadence of justice closing in. Nearby, officers exchanged uneasy glances. Whispers replaced the usual morning chatter as tension thickened the air. The station's usual indifference gave way to a heavy silence, as if the building itself was holding its breath. The agent stopped at Officer Daly Millet's desk. Millet, still attempting to project his usual confidence, glanced up with a flicker of uncertainty when the lead agent spoke, in calm, steady tones. "We need to review the incident involving Miss Leoniez," the agent said plainly. Millet straightened, fingers still hovering over the keyboard, but the smirk that usually played across his face faltered. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not so early, and certainly not by this level of authority. The interrogation began, a methodical unraveling of falsehoods. The agents laid out their evidence, meticulously, grainy surveillance footage, capturing the baton's brutal strike, GPS data disproving Millet's account of the timeline, and the unnotable consistency of Leona's own testimony. Millet shifted uncomfortably in his chair, attempts at deflection falling flat against the cold weight of facts. His voice remained steady, but lacked conviction as he repeated the fabricated story he hoped would hold, one of resistance and threat, one that justified his violent actions. Meanwhile, Officer Cowie lingered on the fringes of the investigation. The crack in his armor of silence widened with every piece of evidence presented. The truth was no longer a distant concept. It was here, confronting him directly. His conscience, once buried beneath fear and loyalty, began to claw its way to the surface. He realized that his silence was no longer neutral, it was complicity. And complicity had a price. Back in the cell, Leona opened her eyes slowly, steadying her breath. The tightness in her jaw and the ache in her temple reminded her of the night's brutality, but they also grounded her in reality. She was still here, still standing. Her sister's words echoed in her mind, "Hold tight, I'll handle the rest." This was no longer a fight fought alone in a cold cell. It was a reckoning, one that would ripple far beyond the walls confining her. The morning sun climbed higher, casting light on a path long obscured by shadows. For the first time since the baton fell, Leona felt the weight of hope settle gently upon her shoulders. The first rays of sunlight painted the sky with soft hues of pink and gold as the morning shift began arriving at the police station. The usual buzz of activity was punctuated by the arrival of two unmarked sedans slipping quietly into the parking lot. Their presence was subtle, but it rippled through the station like a sudden chill. Officers gathered in small groups, exchanging uneasy glances and whispered speculations. Something was different today. The weight of the unknown pressed down on the room, thickening the air. The unmarked vehicle's occupants stepped out, plainclothes agents with worn leather briefcases and badges clipped to their belts, faces etched with quiet authority. They moved with purpose, unhurried but deliberate, carrying the unmistakable aura of those who wield real power. No need for loud announcements or dramatic entrances. Their presence alone shifted the atmosphere. Conversations died mid-sentence. Chairs stopped squeaking. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to dim under the gravity of the moment. Inside, Officer Dale Mai sat at his desk, chewing on a pen as he half-heartedly typed out the day's reports. When he caught sight of the agents, a flicker of recognition crossed his face. He had danced with internal affairs before and survived. This, he thought, was just another inconvenience, an interruption he could shrug off with a few practice moves. He leaned back in his chair, smirking slightly, confident in his ability to control the narrative. After all, he had written hundreds of reports, crafted stories that obscured the truth with bureaucratic precision. The truth, he believed, was a thing easily buried under layers of paperwork and silence. Across the room, Officer Kawai sat stiffly, eyes flicking nervously toward the approaching agents. His fingers tapped a restless rhythm on the edge of his desk, betraying the tension tightening his chest. Unlike Mie, Kawai had not grown comfortable with the shadows. The night's events haunted him like a relentless ghost, replaying in his mind with unyielding clarity. The lead agent approached Mie's desk and spoke calmly but firmly. "Officer Mie, we need to discuss the incident involving Miss Leona Hayes." Mie straightened instantly, masking any trace of discomfort. "That's me," he replied smoothly, rising to his feet. "What's this about?" The agent motioned toward a conference room. "Let's talk." As they moved through the station's corridors, the murmurs of the morning shift faded into silence. Every step brought them closer to a confrontation that would shatter the carefully maintained facade. The conference room door closed behind them with a soft click, sealing the space where truth would clash with deception. The conference room was stark, bathed in the harsh glow of fluorescent lights that revealed every wrinkle of tension on the faces gathered within. The plain walls bore no witness, but the space held the weight of truths about to be uncovered and lies about to be dismantled. The lead agent stood before Officer Dale Miao, unblinking and resolute, as a flickering image appeared on the screen, a street camera recording. Grainy and raw, the footage captured a moment frozen in time. Miao's baton swinging down in a swift arc, striking Leona Hayes' temple with brutal precision. No warning shouted, no resistance seen, just the harsh reality of a violent blow. Mia's jaw clenched as the video played, the evidence stark against his carefully crafted tale. He recited his story with practiced ease. Suspect resisted arrest, became combative. Officer deployed necessary force. His words hung in the air, cold and rehearsed. The agent paused the video at a frame showing Leona's hands, raised, palms open, steady, and clearly non-threatening. "You claim she resisted," the agent said quietly, voice edged with steel. "Here she is still, unarmed, hands visible. How do you explain that?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed Mie's face, but he masked it quickly. Situations escalate fast. Officers must make split-second decisions. You wouldn't understand the pressure. The agent's gaze sharpened, voice unwavering. "No, but the law understands, and it requires accountability." Outside the room, Officer Cowie leaned heavily against the cold wall, jaw tight, eyes haunted. His mind replayed every agonizing detail of the night. The silence as Mii raised his baton, the sudden impact, Leona's shocked fall. Each memory was a weight on his conscience, heavier than he could bear. He asked himself again and again, how did I stand by and say nothing? How could I watch an act of brutality and remain silent? The guilt gnawed relentlessly, threatening to consume him. Back inside, the agents continued their relentless scrutiny. They presented GPS data from the patrol cruiser, revealing timelines that directly contradicted M's fabricated report. Each piece of evidence was a chisel, slowly carving away at the edifice of lies. Sweat beaded on Mie's forehead, his confident facade beginning to crumble. His answers grew terse, defensive, and edged with desperation, but still he clung to his version, unwilling to admit guilt. The atmosphere in the room shifted palpably. The agent's quiet authority pressed down like a tide, turned the balance of power. No longer was Mie the one in control. He was the accused, exposed and unraveling. The moment marked a turning point, a reckoning not just for Mie, but for the entire system that had enabled him. The agent's presence was a reminder that even those who wield power unchecked are not beyond consequence. Outside the conference room, Officer Cowie leaned heavily against the cold, unyielding wall of the police station. His breath came in shallow, uneven bursts, the weight of the night pressed down on his chest like a physical force. Every moment replayed vividly in his mind, the slow raise of the baton, the sickening crack as it connected, Leona's stunned and silent collapse. It was a sequence that haunted him, a sequence he had witnessed but chosen to ignore. His hands trembled slightly as he clenched them into fists, struggling to hold back the surge of guilt flooding his conscience. He was no longer just an observer. He was a silent accomplice. The quiet complicity of his silence felt like a heavy chain, binding him tighter with every passing second. The cost of doing nothing was clear, and it was unbearable. Inside the conference room, the agents shifted their attention to the digital evidence. A cold, unassailable truth laid bare on the glowing screen. The GPS data from the patrol cruiser painted a timeline that directly contradicted the official report Mie had meticulously crafted. The discrepancies were glaring, exposing the fabrications meant to shield him from accountability. Mie's face grew slick with sweat beneath the harsh light. His confident posture slackened, the cracks in his armor beginning to show. His voice, once smooth and rehearsed, grew sharp and defensive, laced with a desperation that betrayed his inner turmoil. Each time he repeated his version of events, the room's silent scrutiny chipped away at his resolve. The lead agent locked eyes with him, unyielding and cold. "You have a choice," the agent said quietly but firmly. "To come clean now, or face the full consequences of your deception." Mie's gaze flickered nervously toward the closed door, seeking an escape in a place where none existed. His throat tightened as the weight of truth settled over him, the moment stretching taut between denial and reluctant acceptance. In that tense silence, Cowie took a trembling step forward, breaking his long-held silence. The words he spoke were tentative, but carried the power of a man choosing to stand with truth for the first time. He had been a bystander, but now his voice would be part of the reckoning. The price of silence was too great to bear any longer. The atmosphere within the station transformed. What had once been a routine facility for arrests and paperwork had become the battleground for a confrontation between truth and falsehood, justice and corruption. The scales were tipping, and the tides of change were undeniable. Leona remained steady, somewhere within the station walls, her strength anchored in the knowledge that her truth was finally breaking through the shadows. The fight that had begun the night before was no longer hers alone. It had become a movement toward justice, fueled by courage and the relentless pursuit of the truth. The conference room held its breath as Officer Cowie stood at the threshold, the weight of his decision pressing down like an unbearable burden. For hours he had watched the interrogation unfold, heard the evidence dismantle the carefully constructed lies. Now, with a trembling voice that betrayed years of suppressed fear and doubt, he took a step inside. "She didn't resist," Cowie said quietly, the words trembling but clear. The lead agent nodded, motioning for him to sit. A small recorder was placed on the table, the red light blinking steadily, capturing every word. Cowie began to recount the night, the moments where silence had been his shield, where fear had kept his voice locked away. He spoke of the baton, the impact, and the helplessness that followed. His confession was a crack in the armor of the station, a break in the code of silence that had protected misconduct for too long. The agents listened, their expressions grave but encouraging. This was the truth they had been waiting for. Outside the walls, the station seemed to hold a different energy, The corridors whispered with hushed conversations and sidewise glances. Officers avoided Mie's eyes, a new understanding settling among them. The man who had once commanded respect now moved like a ghost, shunned and isolated. Minutes later, the lead agent stood and motioned. "Officer Dale Mie, you are under arrest for assault under color of law and falsifying a police report." The cuffs clicked with finality as Mie's confident facade crumbled. He was led away, the weight of his actions trailing behind him like a shadow. Meanwhile, Leona was escorted to the medical room. A nurse gently cleaned the swelling bruise on her temple, her touch kind but professional. Leona accepted the care silently, her eyes calm and unreadable. She had endured far worse than pain. When the nurse finished, Leona was given a chance to collect herself before being released. No apology came from anyone, no words of regret. But Leona walked out of the station with her dignity intact, something no baton, no false report could ever take away. As she passed through the hall, Cowie lingered nearby. His voice was barely above a whisper when he said, "I'm sorry." Leona didn't stop or turn. She simply nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement that forgiveness was complicated and that the path ahead was still uncertain. Outside, word of the arrest spread like wildfire. Rumors ignited, conversations sparked, and the town found itself waking to a truth many had ignored for too long. The incident was no longer just a local matter. It was a symbol of a system ready to be challenged. In her office, Judge Regina Hayes prepared for the battle ahead. She sat at her desk, phone in hand, drafting statements and coordinating with allies. Her voice, calm but resolute, echoed through the phone as she arranged a press conference. "This is bigger than my sister," Regina said firmly. "This is about justice, about a system that must answer for its failures." The fight was just beginning. The press conference was set for mid-morning. By the time reporters and cameras gathered outside the courthouse, the story had already spread throughout the town like wildfire. People gathered in small clusters on the sidewalks, whispers blending with murmurs of disbelief and anticipation. The arrest of Officer Dale Mie was more than just a headline. It was a fracture in the facade of an institution long shielded from scrutiny. Judge Regina Hayes arrived with measured calm, her black coat sweeping behind her as she approached the podium. The crowd hushed immediately, sensing the gravity in her presence. She carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had fought many battles and understood the stakes of this one. "This morning," Regina began, her voice steady and clear, "we stand at a crossroads. The arrest of Officer Mie is not simply about one man's actions. It is a reckoning, a call to confront systemic failures that have allowed injustice to persist far too long." Her words rippled through the crowd, sparking nods, tears, and expressions of solemn recognition. Regina spoke not only for her sister, but for a community tired of silence and shadows. "We are committed to ensuring that no voice is ignored, no truth buried beneath reports and lies. This is about accountability, transparency, and the dignity that every person deserves." As she spoke, cameras captured every measured gesture, every determined glance. The story was no longer just a local incident. It had become a beacon for change. Inside the station, the atmosphere remained tense. Officers who had once dismissed complaints were now forced to reckon with the consequences. Whispers circulated of investigations opening, of policies under review. Some officers expressed quiet relief, others bristled with resistance. Change was inevitable, but the path was uncertain. Leone, meanwhile, returned home under the protective watch of friends and family. Though bruised and weary, she remained resolute. The pain of that night was still fresh, but the promise of justice gave her strength. She thought often of Cowie, the officer whose silence had weighed so heavily. Forgiveness was not immediate, but she understood the complexities of fear and courage intertwined. In the days that followed, the community began to speak more openly. Stories long hidden in the shadows surfaced. Accounts of mistreatment, intimidation, and silence enforced by those sworn to protect. Leona's story had cracked open a door, and through it came a flood of voices ready to be heard. Days after the press conference, the energy in the town shifted palpably. Conversations that had once been hushed or avoided now spilled into the open. Leona Hayes' story had struck a nerve, reverberating far beyond the courthouse steps and police station walls. It ignited a spark, anger, hope, and a long overdue reckoning. In homes and workplaces, in small neighborhood gatherings and over crowded kitchen tables, people began to share their own experiences. Stories of quiet humiliation, fear, and frustration that had been locked away finally found a voice. The arrest of Professor Millet was no longer just about one man's fall from grace. It was a symbol that the system was starting to crack. Judge Regina Hayes transformed her office into a command center of justice. Files and folders lined every surface, filled with reports, complaints, and evidence she had gathered over the years. Her phone was a constant companion, connecting her with federal prosecutors, civil rights attorneys, community leaders, and activists. Each call was a strategic move in a larger game, ensuring that the momentum wouldn't falter. "This is about more than my sister," Regina said during a late-night conversation with a trusted ally. Her voice was steady but filled with conviction. "It's about every person who's been silenced, dismissed, or beaten down by a system that chooses power over justice." Meanwhile, the police station buzzed with an uneasy tension. The federal investigation cast a long shadow over the department. Officers exchanged guarded looks and whispered behind closed doors. For some, the arrival of accountability was a relief, a sign that the long culture of impunity might finally end. For others, it was a threat, a disruption to a status quo they had come to accept or exploit. Officer Cowie, burdened by guilt and the weight of his own silence, began cooperating fully with the investigators. His testimony, once withheld by fear and loyalty, became a crucial pillar in the case against Millet. The courage it took for him to speak out was not lost on Leona or her sister. It was a reminder that change often begins with the breaking of silence. Leona herself returned to the rhythms of daily life, though the world felt altered beneath her feet. The physical wounds from that night were healing, but the emotional scars remained raw. Each glance from strangers, each whispered question, reminded her of how far she had come, and how much further the fight would go. She found strength in the steady support of family and friends, especially Regina. The judge's presence was a steady anchor in the storm swirling around them. Together they faced the uncertainty ahead with a mixture of determination and caution. The community responded in kind. Meetings were held, petitions circulated, and local leaders pressured for transparency and reform. Leona's story was no longer isolated. It became a rallying point, a call to action for those who had suffered in silence. Despite the victories and the progress, the path ahead was fraught with obstacles. The system was slow to change, and resistance simmered beneath polite facades. But for the first time in a long time, there was movement. A new chapter was unfolding, one defined by courage, truth, and the relentless pursuit of justice. The courthouse steps quickly became a focal point for the storm that had erupted. Reporters arrived early, their cameras and microphones ready to capture every moment. By midday, the small plaza was crowded with news crews from local and national outlets, their equipment sprawling across the stone steps like an invasion. The story of Leona Hayes, the law student beaten by a police officer, had exploded overnight, igniting a media frenzy that no one in the town could ignore. Headlines screamed across televisions and social media feeds: "Law student beaten by cop. Justice demanded after brutal attack. Systemic failure exposed." The narrative spread like wildfire, sparking heated debates and calls for accountability far beyond the courthouse walls. Reporters jostled for space, voices overlapping as they shouted questions to public officials and activists alike. The air was thick with anticipation, tension, and the raw energy of a community on edge. Passers-by stopped to watch, drawn in by the mounting drama unfolding in their own backyard. The courthouse, normally a symbol of order and authority, now stood as the backdrop for a story that challenged the very foundation of that authority. Meanwhile, inside homes and local gathering spots, families gathered around televisions and smartphones, watching the news with a mixture of shock and weary recognition. Conversations that had been hushed for years now surfaced boldly. Some spoke in defense of Officer Mie, invoking loyalty to the police or questioning the narrative. Others, long silenced by fear or apathy, shared their own experiences. Stories of harassment, intimidation, and injustice that echoed the pain Leona's story had brought to light. The community found itself divided, the story acting as a mirror reflecting deep and unresolved tensions. For many, Leona's case was the breaking point, the moment when silence was no longer an option. For others, it was a painful challenge to long-system, belief-seasoned allegiances. In response to the growing unrest, town officials organized a series of public meetings and forums. The community center filled quickly as residents packed the folding chairs and lined the walls. The meetings were tense and emotional, a space where raw truths were finally voiced. People shared personal accounts, grievances, and hopes for real change. The energy was charged, sometimes with anger, sometimes with tears, but always with an urgency that demanded attention. These gatherings became more than just meetings. They were a reckoning, a collective demand for transparency, reform, and respect. Leona's story had opened a door, and through it came a flood of voices, ready to be heard. Alone on the courthouse steps, Leona sat quietly, her gaze distant yet focused. The noise of the world around her seemed muted, almost like a distant echo. Her body still ached from the night's violence. The sharp sting of the baton blow, the bruises blossoming across her temple and ribs, but the fight within her was far from over. She reflected on the whirlwind her life had become, how a simple walk home had turned into a public battle for justice and dignity. The attention, the scrutiny, it was overwhelming at times. The questions from strangers, the whispered conversations behind her back. Part of her longed to retreat from the glare of the spotlight, to find refuge in silence and anonymity. Yet beneath that longing, there was a fire, a quiet but unyielding determination that refused to let her story be buried beneath lies and indifference. She understood now that this fight was bigger than herself. It was about every person who had been silenced, dismissed, or broken by a system that too often protected those who wielded power without accountability. As she sat, Regina approached and took the empty space beside her. The judge's presence was comforting, a steady anchor in the turbulent sea of emotions. Without speaking at first, Regina simply sat, letting the silence speak between them. Finally, Regina broke the quiet. "You don't have to do this alone," she said softly, her voice full of conviction. "But you can't walk away from it either." Leona turned to her sister, eyes steady but heavy with the weight of the choice ahead. "I don't know if I'm ready," she admitted quietly. "This isn't what I wanted." Regina nodded understandingly. None of us choose the battles that come to us, but sometimes we're the only ones who can fight them. They sat together on the stone steps, the morning sun warming their faces, sharing a moment of quiet resolve. Later, the first public hearing was held in a packed community hall. Leona sat in the back, listening as residents spoke one by one. The stories poured out, decades of mistreatment, fear, and silence. Voices cracked with emotion, tears flowed openly. People spoke of lost dignity, broken trust, and a desperate need for change. Leona absorbed every word, feeling the weight of their collective pain and the strength it took to finally speak out. It was messy, raw, and deeply human. And it was only the beginning. The community hall was packed beyond capacity, every seat taken, and dozens more standing along the walls and spilling into the hallways. The air was thick with anticipation and unspoken emotion. This was more than a hearing. It was a gathering of decades of pain and frustration, brought into the light by one courageous act. Leona sat quietly near the back, absorbing the weight of the room. Each person who rose to speak carried a story. Stories that had been locked away for years, whispered in private, but now spoken aloud with a fierce urgency. The voices trembled at times, breaking through the walls of silence that had shielded so many from facing the truth. Retired schoolteacher took the microphone first. Her hands shook as she recounted the night her grandson was dragged from their porch by officers, thrown to the ground without cause. Her voice cracked with emotion as she described the helplessness and fear that had gripped her family ever since. Next came a mother whose children had been followed by police on their way home from school. She spoke of sleepless nights, of worry etched into every step her kids took. She described a community living in fear beneath the gaze of those sworn to protect them. One by one, the stories unfolded, each a thread in the larger tapestry of systemic injustice. Tales of racial profiling, intimidation, and abuses of power surfaced, drawing nods of recognition from the audience. Some voices were loud with anger, others soft with grief, but all were united in their demand for change. The room was a mixture of tears, clenched fists, and determined faces. It was raw and messy, and deeply human, a collective reckoning that had been a long time coming. Leona felt the enormity of the moment settle over her like a mantle. This was no longer just her story, it was a shared experience, a communal fight for dignity and respect. The courage in the room was palpable, a force that promised transformation. As the hearing came to a close, the crowd lingered, unwilling to disperse. Conversations sparked about next steps, about organizing, about holding those in power accountable. Plans for community meetings, legal actions, and outreach efforts began to form in whispered discussions. Outside the hall, the morning sun filtered through stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the steps where people gathered in smaller groups. Hugs were exchanged, hands were shaken, and a quiet sense of solidarity grew among the crowd. The town was waking up, ready to face the truths it had long avoided. Leona and Regina stepped outside together, the sounds of the gathering fading behind them. Regina looked at her sister with a mixture of pride and tenderness. "You did good," she said, simply, her voice steady and sincere. Leona met her gaze, a faint smile playing on her lips. "It's just the beginning," she replied softly, her eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the courthouse steps. The journey toward justice was underway. It would be long and fraught with challenges, but the town would never be the same. The seeds of change had been planted, watered by courage, truth, and the refusal to remain silent. And in that moment, surrounded by the stirring voices of her community, Leona understood that her fight was no longer solitary. It was a movement, a call to action that would echo far beyond this town, inspiring others to stand up and be heard. The community hall was filled once again, the atmosphere heavier this time, not just with tension but with a deep, shared anticipation. The second hearing was more than a formality. It was a pivotal moment for the town. The room was crowded with familiar faces and new ones. People had traveled from neighboring towns and cities, drawn by the growing story that had captured national attention. Cameras lined the back wall, reporters scribbled notes, and microphones hovered ready to capture every word spoken. A retired teacher stepped forward first. Her hands trembled as she gripped the microphone. Her voice cracked, frail but determined, as she recounted the night her grandson was violently taken from their porch by officers. Tears welled in her eyes, and her voice faltered under the weight of decades of pain and fear. The room fell silent, the raw emotion weaving a thread through the crowd. For many, this was more than a personal story. It was a collective wound reopened. Leona sat near the back, watching as the woman spoke. Her chest tightened with a mix of sorrow and resolve. She had heard these stories before, but hearing them aloud, in this room filled with witnesses, was different. It was a call to action. When the teacher stepped down, a hush fell over the crowd. All eyes turned toward Leona. She rose slowly, the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, but carried a powerful resonance that filled the room. "I wasn't supposed to be here," she began, steady and calm. "I was supposed to be a law clerk, working quietly behind the scenes. I didn't want to become one of those stories." She paused, letting the room absorb the honesty. "But here's the truth," Leona continued, her tone growing firmer. "When someone believes they can beat you down, lie about you, and bury you in paperwork because of who you are, they're not just attacking you. They're testing the limits of a world that too many accept in silence." Her eyes scanned the room, meeting the gaze of those who had come to listen and those who had come to judge. "You can't fix what you won't name, and we have spent far too long pretending this isn't happening." A quiet ripple of recognition moved through the crowd. Heads nodded, and eyes glistened with unshed tears. Leona's words touched something deep, something both painful and hopeful. "I didn't win anything," she said, her voice softening. "I just refused to disappear." As she finished, the room remained still for a moment, caught in the gravity of what had been said. Then, slowly, the applause began, soft at first, then growing. It wasn't loud or boisterous, but it was lasting. It was the sound of solidarity, of a community beginning to heal and find strength in unity. Leona sat back down, her heart pounding but her spirit steady. The journey was far from over, but the moment was theirs. As the days unfolded, Leona's story reached far beyond the town's borders. News outlets from across the country picked up the narrative. The law student attacked by a police officer who had abused his power. Headlines painted her as a reluctant figure of resistance, a symbol of courage standing against systemic injustice. Interviews were scheduled, reporters called, cameras sought her out. The attention was overwhelming, sometimes invasive, sometimes empowering. Leona found herself thrust into a spotlight she never wanted, but could not refuse. She became the face of a movement many had been waiting for, a voice calling out for change in a system that too often silenced those who dared to speak. Emails poured in, from strangers, offering support, sharing their own stories, and thanking her for her bravery. Despite the growing public attention, Leona remained grounded. She knew that behind every headline was a community still hurting, still waiting for justice. Her fight was not just her own, it was theirs. But the spotlight came with its shadows. Critics questioned her motives. Some accused her of seeking fame or politicizing a personal tragedy. The pressure was relentless, and there were days when the weight of it all threatened to break her. Yet, through it all, Regina stood beside her, silent, unwavering. Their bond was a source of strength, a reminder that Leona was not alone. One quiet morning, the sisters sat together on the courthouse steps before the town awoke. The sky blushed with the first light of dawn, soft and hopeful. Regina glanced at Leona, her eyes full of quiet pride. "You're stronger than you know," she said. Leona smiled faintly, her gaze lingering on the horizon. "I'm learning," she replied softly. The sun rose slowly, casting warm light over the city. In those quiet moments, amidst the promise of a new day, Leona found peace, even as the fight ahead loomed large. The courthouse steps were shrouded in the soft light of early morning, the city slowly stirring awake as dawn spread its gentle hues across the sky. Leona and Regina sat side by side on the cool stone, their shoulders brushing together in quiet solidarity, a silent promise that neither would face the coming battles alone. The world around them was just beginning to pulse with life. Distant traffic, the murmur of early risers, the faint chirping of birds greeting the new day. It was a stark contrast to the heaviness that had filled their lives in recent weeks. A reminder that even amidst turmoil, there was always space for hope. Leona's gaze drifted over the familiar cityscape, the buildings she had walked past countless times, now bathed in the warm glow of morning light. This place, once just a backdrop to her daily life, had become the stage for a story that transcended her own experience. It was daunting, but also deeply empowering. Regina observed her sister carefully, noticing the exhaustion etched in the lines around her eyes, but also the fierce determination that still burned brightly within. "You've carried so much," she said gently, breaking the comfortable silence, "but you don't have to carry it alone." Leona nodded slowly, the weight of their shared journey evident in her eyes. "Sometimes it feels like I'm speaking for everyone who's been silenced," she confessed. "That responsibility, it's heavy." "It is," Regina agreed, her voice steady and warm. "But your voice is powerful. It's already changing minds, shifting hearts. You've sparked something real." They sat together quietly, the only sounds those of the city awakening around them. It was a rare moment of peace, a calm pause before the next wave of challenges would inevitably arrive. Leona's thoughts wandered to the faces she'd seen during community meetings, the tearful, the angry, the hopeful. She remembered the voices that had spoken out at the hearings, the stories that had finally found light after years in shadow. She thought of the critics and skeptics who questioned her motives and tried to diminish her courage. And she thought of the days when the burden of it all felt nearly unbearable. Yet in this moment, with the sun rising and the future stretching out before her, she found a renewed strength. She realized that the fight was no longer hers alone. It belonged to every person who longed for dignity, justice, and respect. It was a movement, a call to action that could no longer be ignored. Regina reached over, placing a reassuring hand on Leona's. "Whatever comes next, we face it together, and we will make sure their voices are heard." Leona squeezed her sister's hand, a silent vow passing between them. As the sun climbed higher, casting golden light over the city and their faces, the shadows of the past began to fade. The new day promised not just change, but the possibility of healing and renewal. And together, Leona and Regina rose from the steps, ready to face whatever lay ahead, united, resilient, and unbreakable. The internal review was swift and uncompromising. An independent audit team arrived at the police department, tasked with digging through years of records, complaints, and disciplinary files. Their investigation quickly uncovered a disturbing pattern. Dozens of suppressed complaints against Officer Dalemy and others, who had operated with impunity for years. Files that should have led to suspensions or firings were buried under bureaucratic indifference. Reports vanished or were dismissed with minimal investigation. The culture of silence and protection had allowed abuses to flourish unchecked. What had happened to Leona was not an isolated incident. It was part of a systemic failure. The audit team's findings were damning, laying bare the depth of corruption and neglect within the department. The report called for sweeping changes, demanding accountability, not just for individual officers, but for the leadership that had allowed this to persist. In the wake of the audit, city officials and police leadership scrambled to respond. Public pressure demanded action, and the department announced a series of reforms aimed at rebuilding trust. New training policies were rolled out with urgency. Officers underwent comprehensive education on use of force procedures, emphasizing de-escalation and respect for civil rights. The department promised transparency, introducing body cameras and strict reporting requirements for any use of force. The policy changes marked a turning point, a shift from protectionism to accountability. It was a step toward healing the fractured relationship between law enforcement and the community they served. Amid the changes, Officer Cowie found himself unable to continue. The weight of his silence, the knowledge of what he had witnessed and failed to stop, became unbearable. After long nights of wrestling with guilt and regret, he submitted his resignation. His departure was quiet, without fanfare. Cowie left behind a legacy of conflict, a man caught between loyalty and conscience who ultimately chose to step away rather than stay complicit. Meanwhile, the federal trial of Officer Mie began to take shape. Courtroom scenes unfolded with intensity. Regina Hayes sat in the gallery, her presence commanding but restrained as she watched the proceedings. Mia pleaded not guilty, his defense team painting him as a victim of circumstance and misunderstanding. But the weight of evidence was mounting. Witness testimonies, surveillance footage, and the damning internal audit all converged into a compelling case against him. Regina's eyes never left the courtroom, her resolve unwavering. This trial was more than justice for Leona. It was a statement to the system that abuses of power would no longer be tolerated Back at law school, Leona prepared to return to her studies. The halls felt different now, charged with the awareness of what she had endured and what she represented. Classmates greeted her with a mixture of respect, awkwardness, and quiet admiration. Some approached cautiously, unsure how to engage with the woman whose story had captured the nation's attention. Others offered simple words of support. Leona accepted these gestures with grace, knowing that her journey was far from over. She was stepping back into the life she had paused, carrying with her the strength and determination to finish what she had started. The community watched closely as the department began implementing reforms. The rollout of new policies was deliberate and public, a necessary step to restore trust fractured by years of misconduct. Officers attended extensive training sessions focused on de-escalation techniques, bias awareness, and legal protocols designed to protect citizens' rights. The introduction of body cameras promised a new era of transparency, though skepticism lingered. Many residents wondered if these measures would be enough or if they were simply gestures designed to placate a restless public. But for Leona and her supporters, these changes represented a hard-fought victory, a tangible shift toward accountability. In the days following the announcements, Cowie's resignation became a quiet but powerful symbol. His decision to step down was met with mixed reactions. Some viewed it as an admission of guilt. Others saw it as an act of conscience, a man unwilling to remain silent in the face of wrongdoing. For Cowie, the choice was painful but necessary. The burden of witnessing injustice without intervening had fractured his sense of self. Leaving the force was not just a resignation, it was a step toward redemption, a chance to reckon with his past and seek forgiveness. Meanwhile, the courtroom became a battleclear where justice and denial collided. The trial of Officer Millet drew national attention, with media outlets covering every twist and turn. Regina Hayes, seated firmly in the gallery, was a quiet presence, focused and unyielding as the case unfolded. Millet's defense team attempted to discredit witnesses and minimize the severity of his actions, portraying him as a man under pressure and misunderstanding. But the evidence told a different story, one of abuse, falsehood, and betrayal of public trust. Witness after witness testified, including community members who shared painful experiences of harassment and fear. The trial became more than a legal proceeding. It was a public reckoning, shining a harsh light on a system desperately in need of change. Back at school, Leona found her return to classes to be a complex experience. Some classmates greeted her warmly, offering congratulations and support. Others were hesitant, unsure how to bridge the gap between the woman who had become a symbol and the student they knew before. Leona navigated these interactions with quiet strength, aware that her story had changed her and the space around her. She was determined to finish her education, not as a victim, but as a force for change. Leona's return to law school marked a new chapter, both challenging and hopeful. The hallways that had once felt routine now carried an undercurrent of awareness. Her classmates and professors recognized the woman who had become a symbol of resistance and change. Some greeted her with quiet admiration, offering nods of respect or gentle words of encouragement. Others struggled to find the right balance between acknowledgement and normalcy, unsure how to engage with someone whose story had dominated headlines and stirred deep emotions nationwide. Leona accepted these interactions with grace, understanding the complexity of her position. She was no longer just a student, she was a voice for many, a reminder that justice was a living, breathing struggle. Her focus remained steadfast, finishing her education, sharpening her skills to fight the systemic injustices she had come face to face with. Meanwhile, the courtroom battles continued to unfold with intensity. Officer Millet's trial became a national spectacle, a test case for police accountability in communities across the country. Regina Hayes, poised and resolute, watched each day with unwavering commitment, knowing the stakes extended far beyond this one case. Public scrutiny remained fierce. Supporters rallied behind Leona and the broader movement for reform. Critics attempted to undermine their efforts, but the momentum was undeniable. As the trial progressed, the department's reforms began to show tentative results. New policies slowly took root, cultural shifts emerged, and a renewed dialogue about justice and policing entered public discourse. Leona often reflected on the journey that had brought her here, the pain, the courage, and the resilience. She knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with obstacles, but she was ready, for herself, for her community, and for all those whose voices still needed to be heard. The courtroom buzzed with an electric tension as the federal trial against Officer Daomie officially commenced. It was more than just a trial. It was a battleground where justice, truth, and accountability would collide. The walls of the packed courtroom seemed to absorb the weight of history, every spectator aware that this case represented something far larger than one man's actions. Federal prosecutors took the stand with an unwavering focus. Their presentation was precise, carefully constructing a narrative built on facts and evidence that would leave little room for doubt. They opened with the grainy surveillance footage, the slow-motion replay of the baton's cruel arc, the sickening impact, and Leona Hayes' stunned and unresisting posture. The images were stark, raw, and impossible to ignore. Witnesses were called one after another. Some were experts in police procedures, explaining what proper conduct should look like under the law. Others were community members who shared their own harrowing experiences of misconduct and fear. Their testimonies, delivered with calm clarity, wove a tapestry of systemic abuse and personal betrayal. Each story chipped away at the defense's attempts to paint Mie as a man under pressure, making split-second decisions. The defense team was no less determined. They rose to challenge every piece of evidence, questioning the validity of the recordings, the reliability of witness recollections, and the motives behind the testimonies. They portrayed Mie as a dedicated officer caught in a complex, high-pressure situation where mistakes were inevitable. But the prosecutors met every claim with unrelenting rigor. They presented the internal audit detailing years of suppressed complaints and overlooked misconduct. They pointed out glaring inconsistencies between Mie's official reports and the facts uncovered. They reminded the jury that justice was not about protecting those who violated the public's trust, but about holding them accountable. The jury sat in rapt attention, absorbing the weight of the evidence, the faces and voices of those who had suffered, and the sobering reality of the law. The courtroom was hushed, save for the measured cadence of arguments and objections, every word imbued with profound consequence. Leona sat quietly with Regina in the gallery. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her spirit remained steady and unbroken. This trial was the culmination of years of pain, courage, and relentless pursuit of truth. It was the reckoning that had to come, the moment when a man who had betrayed his oath faced the consequences. As the day wore on, each new piece of testimony and evidence reinforced the message: no one was above the law. The trial was more than a legal proceeding. It was a symbol of hope for a community demanding justice and a step towards systemic change. After days filled with intense testimonies, legal arguments, and the presentation of overwhelming evidence, the trial of Officer Daomie moved into its final, pivotal phase. The prosecutors had painstakingly constructed a narrative that laid bare the abuse of power and the betrayal of the badge he wore. Their case was clear. Mie's actions were not isolated incidents or mistakes made under pressure, but a calculated violation of the public trust. The defense team, however, made a determined last stand. They called character witnesses who spoke of Mie's years of service and dedication. They emphasized the stress and split-second nature of policing, attempting to cast doubt on the prosecution's portrayal. They painted him as a man caught in a difficult situation, human and fallible. But the courtroom's mood remained steady, unshaken by these efforts. The jurors, having witnessed the evidence and heard the stories of victims and experts alike, appeared resolute. The facade of excuses and deflections had crumbled beneath the weight of truth. When closing arguments concluded, the judge addressed the jury with precise instructions. outlining the legal standards that must guide their decision. The room fell silent, the gravity of the moment palpable as the jurors withdrew to deliberate. Hours later, the tension in the courtroom reached its peak. The jury returned, their faces serious as they prepared to deliver the verdict that had been anticipated by so many. The foreperson stood, voice steady but heavy with significance. "All counts, we find the defendant guilty." The words echoed through the chamber, carrying the weight of justice finally served. The courtroom seemed to exhale collectively. Officer Millet, once brimming with defiance and confidence, now sat in stunned silence, the reality of his downfall settling in. The judge proceeded to pronounce the sentence, a significant prison term that reflected not only the severity of the crimes, but the urgent need to send a message about accountability and the limits of power. The sentence was a clear declaration that abuses of authority would not be tolerated. Outside the courthouse, news of the verdict spread rapidly, igniting waves of emotion across the community. People gathered in small groups, some weeping openly, others embracing tightly. The sense of relief was profound, but tempered by the understanding that this was but one step in a much longer journey. For many, the conviction represented more than just justice for Leona Hayes. It was a victory for every person who had been silenced, ignored, or mistreated by a system that too often protected the powerful. It was a beacon of hope in a landscape too long marked by fear and injustice. Leona stepped forward to deliver a public statement. Her voice was calm, yet carried the unmistakable strength of someone who had endured pain and emerged unbroken. "Justice isn't a victory," she said clearly, her eyes meeting those of the crowd and cameras alike. "It's a beginning." Her words resonated deeply, a call to continue the fight for true equality, transparency, and accountability. The verdict closed one chapter but opened many more, challenging the community to keep pushing forward, to build a system worthy of its promise. In the wake of the verdict, a slow but steady healing began to take hold in the town. The initial surge of emotion, shock, anger, relief, gave way to a more measured, determined resolve. Public meetings, once charged with protest and outrage, evolved into organized forums dedicated to real, lasting reform. The community was no longer reacting, it was planning. Citizens, activists, local leaders, and officials gathered regularly in school gyms, community centers, and town halls. These were not spaces of division, but of collaboration, where ideas were exchanged and strategies formed. The focus shifted toward building a future where justice wasn't a rare victory, but a daily reality. A system built on dignity, respect, and accountability. Leona found herself at the heart of this movement, though she remained humble about the role she had come to play. She spoke at these meetings with quiet strength, sharing her story not for sympathy, but as a beacon, a challenge to face the uncomfortable truths that many still preferred to ignore. She urged her community to look beyond individual cases and recognize the systemic issues that allowed injustice to persist. Her voice became a call for vigilance and collective responsibility, a reminder that the fight for justice required ongoing courage and commitment. Walking through the neighborhood where her ordeal had begun, Leona felt the subtle but powerful shifts taking root. The streets, once heavy with the weight of fear and suspicion, now seemed lighter. The shadows that had loomed so large began to recede. Though her scars remained visible bruises and the deeper, unseen wounds, she carried herself with a newfound peace and resilience. The fear that had gripped her tightened no longer held sway over her steps. Each movement forward was a testament to survival and hope. Leona understood that the path ahead was still fraught with challenges. Change, especially systemic change, was slow and often met with resistance. But in moments like these, in the quiet streets bathed in morning light, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of transformation. Her journey had become more than a personal struggle. It was a beacon for a community and a nation grappling with the urgent need for reform. Leona sat quietly on the courthouse steps, the cool stone beneath her hands grounding her in the moment. The neighborhood buzzed with life around her, the joyous shouts of children chasing one another, the rhythmic thump of a ball bouncing against brick walls, the occasional burst of laughter weaving through the air. This simple scene of carefree play was a stark contrast to the battles she had faced to arrive at this place. She watched the children, faces glowing with the pure light of innocence, moving with a freedom she longed to see extended to every child. For a fleeting moment, she let herself imagine a world where fear did not shadow every step, where dignity was not a privilege fought for, but a birthright freely given. The past year's weight rested heavily on her shoulders, yet hope softened the burden. It was a hope born not merely of legal victories or headlines, but of the courage ignited in a community that had stood together in the face of adversity. The journey had been fraught with pain and uncertainty, moments when giving up seemed the easier choice. Yet, through it all, resilience had prevailed. Her gaze drifted from the playing children to the courthouse behind her, a symbol of the justice she had fought and the system she now sought to change. The path had been long and winding, but each step had been a testament to the power of speaking truth and demanding accountability. As the soft sound of footsteps approached, Leona turned to see her sister Regina, moving quietly toward her. The judge's presence was a steady beacon in a turbulent world, a reminder of the strength that came from family and shared purpose. Regina settled beside Leona, her eyes reflecting pride, compassion, and a deep understanding of the sacrifices made. "You did what many never dared," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of battles fought and won. Leona returned the look with a small, weary smile. "I didn't do it alone," she replied gently. "It was all of us. Every voice, every hand raised in solidarity." For a long moment, they sat together in comfortable silence, the sounds of the neighborhood filling the space between them. Watching the children play, they shared a quiet reflection, not just on what had been accomplished, but on the work still to come. The world was beginning to change, but the fight for justice was far from over. This moment, though peaceful, was merely a pause before the next wave of challenges. Leona took a deep breath, feeling the sun's warmth on her face and the strength of her sister beside her. Together, they embodied the legacy of courage, proof that, when one voice speaks out, others find the strength to follow. The quiet calm on the courthouse steps was soon broken by the soft murmur of footsteps and voices. A group of younger law students approached Leona, their faces bright with a mixture of awe, gratitude, and determination. They had followed her journey closely, watched as she stood firm against injustice, seen the courage it took to challenge a system built on silence. One by one, they stepped forward, introducing themselves with a mixture of reverence and resolve. Hands were shaken, words of thanks exchanged. Some spoke haltingly about their own struggles, battles with self-doubt, encounters with discrimination, the heavy weight of fear that sometimes threatened to hold them back. Yet here, in Leona's presence, they found inspiration, a reminder that resilience and the willingness to stand for justice could overcome even the deepest challenges. Leona listened attentively, offering words of encouragement drawn from her own hard-fought experience. She spoke softly, but with conviction, reminding them that every journey was unique but shaped by a common thread: the courage to raise one's voice, even when it trembled. For these students, Leona was no longer just a survivor of violence and systemic failure. She had become a beacon, a guide lighting the path toward change. Their presence was a testament to the power of one voice multiplied, a reminder that the fight for justice was ongoing, a legacy passed down from generation to generation, fueled by hope, determination, and tenacity. Nearby, Regina watched the scene with a swelling heart. This was more than a personal victory for her sister. It was the planting of seeds for future leaders, young people ready to carry the torch forward with fresh energy, insight, and vision. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where justice and dignity were fought for not just in courtrooms, but in classrooms, community centers, and neighborhoods across the country. But amidst the hope and the promise, there remained a sober awareness. The system that had allowed such injustice to flourish was deeply entrenched. Change was slow and often met with resistance from those unwilling to relinquish power or confront uncomfortable truths. Leona and Regina understood this reality intimately. Their story, powerful and transformative as it was, did not mark the end of the struggle. Rather, it served as a beacon, an invitation to vigilance, persistence, and collective action. It was a call to all who cared to listen, to stand together and continue pushing for a world where justice was not the exception, but the rule. Together, the sisters reaffirmed their commitment to the communities that had rallied around them, to the countless voices still waiting to be heard, and to the enduring promise of a more just and equitable future. They knew the journey ahead would be long and challenging, but with courage and unity, it was a journey worth taking. The sun traced a slow arc across the sky, stretching long shadows over the courthouse steps where Leona and Regina sat side by side. Around them, the city pulsed with the rhythm of everyday life. The stinted laughter of children playing in the nearby park, the hum of cars weaving through streets, and the murmur of voices carrying on the wind. It was a living reminder of the community they had fought for and the fragile hope for change still unfolding. Their conversation was soft, layered with the weight of what had passed and the uncertain promise of what lay ahead. "You know," Regina began, her voice low but steady, "dignity isn't something given freely. It's something you have to claim. And once claimed, no one, not even the darkest forces, can take it away." Leona absorbed the words, feeling their truth resonate deep within her. This was a lesson not learned in classrooms or courtrooms, but forged in the fires of lived experience, the harsh reality of systemic injustice, and the quiet, unyielding power of resistance. They spoke quietly of the many voices that had joined theirs, the children playing nearby, whose laughter was a testament to innocence and possibility, the young law students who sought guidance and inspiration, and the countless community members who had found strength and solidarity in their courage. Each person was a thread in the vast tapestry of change they were helping to weave. But their conversation was not without realism. They acknowledged the necessity of vigilance, the enduring struggle to prevent complacency and resistance from undoing progress. Change was not a swift tide, but a slow current, often met with pushback from those entrenched in power. Leona's gaze drifted to the horizon, where the city's skyline stood silhouetted against the fading light. To her, it was a mirror of their journey, an ever-shifting landscape marked by struggle and hope, shadow and light. The road had been long and fraught with challenges, but it was also illuminated by moments of courage, truth, and solidarity. As dusk settled, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose, the sisters rose together. Their steps were steady, grounded by the knowledge that their legacy was not defined solely by victories won, but by the courage to continue standing, speaking, and fighting. They knew the journey ahead would be difficult, full of setbacks, challenges, and moments that tested the very core of their resolve. But they also knew that when one voice dares to speak true, it empowers others to find their own strength and speak theirs. And in that collective chorus of voices, true change is born,